What is up, guys? We are here with some session reviews over the next few days from a session that I played last night on at 1-2 heads up. There's a couple interesting hands out of the session that we will be reviewing in a few different videos. And I know a lot of you are playing 6 max, but I do encourage you to watch heads up fudge and training videos, and also, kind of study it a bit yourself or even play it. It will help your game overall, and it will help you better understand ranges and equity distributions as you kind of move forward. So we're going to jump into this hand that we played here with double suited aces on the button. We'll see a clear open and we get called, and then we face a check on the flop, which is pretty standard in heads up. Most people don't play with a leading frequency out of position. And so then we have to sort of look at our hand and think, okay, nut flush draw here with some, current and future showdown value with our aces. What nut flush draws do we want to really bet on this board? And, we can look at that in the kind of heads up PLO trainer. And if we look at any hand that's not bigger than, let's say 2 pair with the nut flush draw, we can see that like a good chunk of our nut flush draws are bang here. We can often call a check raise, and it's going to be a board that definitely hits a big blind calling range harder in heads up, but still, more limited combos that are going to connect well with the lower straight cards, as it is only a 70% defending range and not as wide as the button open. So if we then want to think about, okay, well, what do we do with kind of our aces or overpairs in general? It definitely reduces our betting frequency just because we do have showdown value, and, we do want to often maintain a small pot so that we can utilize our strong pair, and we don't want to get check raised, by hands like 6-5 and just get put into like a tough kind of bluff catching situation with a hand that will be, a pretty bad bluff catcher on a lot of runouts. Having the 6 reduces that a little bit further. We're kind of removing some of the hands that our opponent will be able to continue with, and also on a straight board, the pair blockers are a little bit less relevant in terms of the fold equity that we're going to have. But we have to also consider our side cards when we bet here, because obviously when we bet, we're not going to bet fold. So we're going to be calling here. So it would be nice to have some higher side cards in order to make better 2 pairs on the turn, and 2 pairs that also don't interact with the board as much. So when we turn, a king, it's going to be a lot easier for us to call a pot size turn bet. Because we'll have a lot more equity against his bluffs, with a king, queen, jack type hands. But once we start getting into like the 10 range or the 9 range, we're definitely looking to check back, because those 2 pairs on the turn are obviously very vulnerable, but also they bring a lot more connectivity to the board and allow our opponent to continue barreling after they check raise. Playing against most players, when you see something like this though, and you see 72% lead frequency with sort of nut flush draws, you can kind of probably get closer to full range, given that players are not check raising enough, and so it allows you to realize your value, and you won't get into these kind of massive spots where they start playing really aggressive, and you have to fold away some equity either on the flop or the turn. And this player particularly has a pretty low check raising range, so I think kind of does make sense to go ahead and bet this hand in position. So we do go ahead and bet, and we do face the check raise, and obviously it's a hand that we're never folding. Never gonna bluff kind of 3-bet this type of hand here without any key blockers. If we have like a hand like 5-7, sure, we can start kind of coming back over the top, but I think pretty standard call here, and we go to the turn, and we get the top pairing card here, which is obviously reasonably good for our range. We will make a lot of boats on this card, and so our opponent does have to be a bit careful here. and we'll see in the solver that, you know, the sizing that he's going to kind of choose here is 1/3, you know, so that he can continue to bet some of his straights. I mean, this board is a little bit more connected, so he will continue to bet some of his straights, and, you know, those, you know, likely, you know, maybe with a pair blocker, or kind of unblocking some flush draws is probably, you know, going to be like your best bet here in terms of kind of leads. And this is where it starts kind of like diverging from GTO, because the check raises that our opponent is going to have on the flop, in my opinion, when he seems to be very value heavy and, you know, a lot more skewed towards the straight, is that a solver here is still going to bet, you know, a hand like 4-3 a good amount of the time as a bluff, and will continue to barrel off with it. And, you know, the solver here will also have a lot more like 6-4 in the range, you know, even though we have blockers or like 4-4 type hands, because, you know, the solver is going to check raise like 6-4-5, whereas population, or this guy specifically, is less likely to do that. So, you know, I did put him mostly on kind of straights here, and so we have a kind of decision to make: is do we want to just call, or do we want to jam here? And, you know, in a solver world, you know, we don't really have any raises, and, you know, that is obviously because we're in a reasonably significant polarity disadvantage, and equity disadvantage on this turn. Actually, equities were probably pretty close, but definitely a polarity disadvantage, and so we don't want to raise and fold out hands like 4-3. Or end up running into 4-4, 6-4, those types of hands. And so that's why the solver is mainly just going to call here. So like when we look at our holding, obviously if we're not raising basically any of our range, it shouldn't be there too much. But if we look at ace, queen, queen six, and spades, we'll see that there is actually, it's very close when it comes to this particular hand. And, you know, that's because of his kind of wider range, in terms of he can do this with some hands that are going to have to bet call that we're actually ahead of. We obviously block the top end of his range, and so the solver is like relatively close between these two. But I think if you change one assumption, which is what I did in a different sim here, because we did end up jamming, and that's why I wanted to see if it was kind of a punt. Was if we run this sim where basically I give our position only 5-7 on this board, so only the straight, and, you know, took away boards from his range, because I personally don't think that this player or that many players are raising 6-4, 4-4 on the flop. A lot of them are just going to call, and, you know, we do heavily block the 6 as well. So I just think it skews his range heavily towards the straight. And then we run like the same situation with our hand of ace, ace, queen, 6, and spades. You'll see that it basically becomes a pure raise here. And that's because if we jam here at this point, I mean, we can obviously call, we have decent equity if we call, but if we jam, we're going to get him to fold straights a bunch of the time. So if he has kind of like his 5-7 here, like, just, you know, it's going to be a 45% full frequency, and if you take out well, I guess he unblocks spades, so he's going to call a bit more, but, you know, a good chunk of that 5-7 is going to actually fold the turn. So when we raise with our particular hand, we get our opponent to fold half of the time, or we get it in with 30% equity against the straight, which is not a bad deal whatsoever. So looking at this, it actually was not that, it wasn't a punt, and I kind of thought that it might be in game. I guess my misunderstanding here from the GTO perspective was that I thought we would have some raises in position here, at least a small percentage, but we basically don't ever raise against a more balanced GTO player, given that sort of like polarity disadvantage, and the fact that we're really only folding out bluffs that, you know, we don't really need much protection against at this point. So misunderstanding, I think, from the solver perspective by a little bit, but I think against adjusted ranges made a pretty good raise here, and he does end up snapping it off, and he did have the straight but with the pair blockers as well, so he's obviously never folding here and makes a bit more sense with his hand. But I think some insights to take away there, and we will be back with some more hands to look at over the next few days. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and good luck at the tables out there.